Our text today, 2 Corinthians 6, 1 through 13. So let's read together. As God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, "In the time of my favor, I heard you, and in the day of salvation, I helped you." I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. We put no stumbling block in anyone's path, so that our ministry will not be discredited. Rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardships, and distresses, in beatings, imprisonments, and riots, in hard work, sleepless nights, and hunger, in purity, understanding, patience, and kindness, in the Holy Spirit and in sincere love, in truthful speech and in the power of God, with weapons of righteousness in the right hand and in the left, through glory and dishonor, bad report and good report, genuine yet regarded as impostors, known yet regarded as unknown, dying and yet we live on, beaten and yet not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and we have opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak to you as my children. Open wide your hearts also. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The first thing in Paul's response to the Corinthians that stands out to me, especially in the context of learning how to examine our interior lives, is his complete vulnerability before his church plant and their apparent criticism of him. I mean, there are so many other ways he could have chosen to respond, depending on what he was feeling internally. He could have denied his hardships out of embarrassment or a sense of inferiority. He could have defended himself in a way that shamed the Corinthians for their spiritual lack of insight, or he could have just refused to engage with them altogether. But instead, what we see in Paul's response is a sincere and vulnerable openness to God's transforming grace in those places of greatest struggle in Paul's life. Notice again what he says here. In troubles and hardships and distresses, in beatings and imprisonments and riots, and then there's this unexpected grace-filled response. In purity, understanding, patience, and kindness, in the Holy Spirit and in sincere love. And then we see the effect when transforming grace meets those really terrible and difficult circumstances. Sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Poor, yet making many rich. Having nothing and yet possessing everything. And it's this transforming grace that Paul has experienced that he urges the Corinthians not to receive in vain. And it's kind of an interesting line, to not receive grace in vain. What does that mean? Well, in the original language, the word for vain here carries the connotation of being ineffective or empty. And so what Paul is arguing for is the kind of grace that takes root in our lives. It's the kind of grace that has effect, that has the generative power of a seed to grow and produce good fruit in our life. The grace that we see in Paul's life is not simply the kind that just gets through hardships and then is able to reflect back on it in a positive way. No, this is something more. The grace that we see in this passage shapes Paul's self-narrative and his reactions in the midst of the struggles, in the midst of the hard circumstances. And so instead of complaining or defensiveness or defeat and bitterness, we see instead good fruit, right there, unexpectedly, in the middle of his catalog, a very long catalog of hardships. This is the generative power, the good fruit of effective grace that is not accepted in vain, but is welcomed into those areas of Paul's life that he would have been tempted, perhaps, to hide or tempted to try to control. Accepting God's grace in the middle of hardship means allowing God's grace to take root in those deep, hidden places and change us. God's grace is always there. It's not a matter of trying to earn God's grace. It's there for us, But realizing we need it, that's the next step. Realizing that we need it and opening ourselves up to God and others is a radical act of vulnerability. And it's this grace that allows Paul to model the very thing he is asking of the Corinthians, and that is to be vulnerable, to be open with him, to reflect on how and why they're treating him a certain way, and to change the orientation of their hearts towards him to match his own compassionate posture towards them. We're not withholding our affection from you, he says, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak to you as my children. Open up your hearts to us also. And the second thing that stands out to me about Paul's response is that he's not speaking in the singular here. As God's co-workers, we urge you, open up your hearts to us. Paul is walking through life and enduring these hard times and having his perspective changed with other people. He is not alone. Grace is at work in and through his community. And while we cannot know the specific interior examination practices Paul might have practiced, we see the result. We see the result of God's grace in how he perceives his experiences and how he responds to those difficult times, and not only difficult times, but pretty difficult people. And so the question we might bring to the passage for ourselves then is, okay, I see the result, I like it, I want to be like that, but how do I actually get there? How do I accept effective grace into my life? And last year, I had a plan, a great plan I thought would work. I had just finished my final year of seminary and a year of being a hospital chaplain resident, and both of these things were finishing at the same time. And so I thought that I would go and hike 3 weeks of the El Camino on the northern coast of Spain. And I was hoping, there's some pictures, my cousin Emily and I went together, and I was hoping that hiking these 3 weeks of this pilgrimage would help me revive my spiritual life and find a sense of direction for the next season. And for those of you who don't know what the El Camino is, I didn't until a year ago. It is an ancient hiking pilgrimage that traces its origin back to the medieval days, actually. And today, thousands of pilgrims from all over the world continue to fly to Spain to hike these various routes. Some come for religious reasons, some just come because they want a good hike. Whatever the reason is, all these people find themselves there. And there's different routes you can take, and they all end up in Santiago de Compostela, which is the traditional burial site of St. James the Apostle. And so I remember being in this season of life, and to be honest, I wasn't my best self. I was just trying to survive, and I thought if I can just finish school, get through finals, finish these shifts, it doesn't matter how I'm acting right now, because once I get to Spain and I begin this pilgrimage, I'm just gonna automatically enter into this inner state of peace and self-insight and awareness, and it's gonna be just a beautiful time. Yes, well, turns out that adding a super heavy backpack, as you can see in that picture, and 15 miles of hiking every single day does not automatically make you a more spiritually grounded person. It actually kind of made me a worse person. I think it was within 2 hours of hiking that Camino trail that my cousin and I had chosen, we were hopelessly lost. I don't even know how we got that lost. It wasn't just, we strayed from the path. We were on the wrong side in a different forest in the middle of the thickets, 3 hours off the path, and wondering why in the world 2 directionally challenged young people had decided to go on a pilgrimage that's wholly dependent on navigational skills. But there we were. We had to do it. We were there. We had our backpacks. We were ready to go. And we hadn't packed enough food or water because we had vastly underestimated how long it was going to take us to get from point A to point B. And we didn't want our backpacks to be too heavy. And so we had wisely thought that the first thing to go was not our books or journals, but food and water, which in retrospect, don't recommend. But we were there, and I think we got into the city the first night around 10 p.m. Hostels fill up at 4 p.m., so we were a little bit late, and we had to take a bus, we had to find another city. We were basically wandering around looking for an empty room in the inn that first night. And that was just day 1. By day 3, my cousin Emily, again, who you see in this picture, had developed such terrible blisters on her feet that that we had to take her to the urgent care to get seen by a doctor who had to basically fix her up and bandage her feet. And she faithfully walked the rest of that path with blistered feet. And I don't know how she did it, but she did. And every day of this Camino brought a different challenge, a different plot twist. And it was Emily, my cousin, who realized pretty quickly that our shared desire to know ourselves and to know God better through going on this pilgrimage was not something that was just going to happen on its own, without intentionality. God's grace was there, but we were at risk. God's grace was there, but we were at risk, like the Corinthians, of not receiving it, of receiving it in vain and not seeing the effect in our lives, and thus ending the pilgrimage the very same people who began it. Because as it turns out, it wasn't the trail that shaped us and formed our spiritual lives, but rather it was the trail that provided the time and the opportunity for us to learn to ask good questions, to learn how to be vulnerable with each other and our needs, to learn how to be vulnerable with God, and even with random pilgrims that we met along the way who became our friends. And so some of the questions we began to repeatedly ask ourselves in the morning when we began hiking, and then at the end of the day. And we asked these questions when we felt like it and even when we didn't. They were just simple questions, like, what are you worried about today? What are you hoping for? What are you carrying, aside from your backpack, that you think God might want to lighten or help you let go of? What didn't go well today? And why do you think that aspect of the day was difficult for you? What do you think God has for you today, in this season, on the Camino, or sometimes we couldn't even bear to think ahead more than just an hour. So what does God have for you in this 1 hour as you get up this next hill? And we would think about that and we would process that. And over 200 miles of empty highways and seaside cliffs and cobbled roads and wooded paths, we found that the trail certainly didn't get easier and the obstacles didn't lessen, but the way that we responded to each other and to the struggles and the way that we reflected on those struggles did. And that's us there at the very end, the last day when we finally made it. And in his book, Velotis talks about the importance of being vulnerable with ourselves and with others, as we saw in Paul's life. And Velotis invites us to find mentors or trusted friends that can journey along this path with us, whether this concerns past hurts or disorientation or current feelings. And he specifically invites people to begin interior examination with 4 categories. There's no end to the categories you could examine, but he says, why not start with these 4? Your family of origin, there's a lot going on there. The scripts or the patterns that you might have picked up in your family, or perhaps for some, the trauma that you experienced in your family. Your anxieties, 3rd, your feelings, and finally, the thing that comes out of all of that, your responses and your reactions. And then Velotis offers a very helpful set of questions that we can stop and ask ourselves, kind of like the questions Emily and I were developing. But he suggests if we begin with these questions, we're going to be able to better navigate our inner world and thus experience a more deeply formed and integrated life. And so those questions that he lays out are the following. Number 1, what happened? Number 2, what am I feeling? Number 3, what is the story I'm telling myself? Number 4, what does the gospel say? And number 5, what counter-instinctual action is needed? And about 2 years ago, as I mentioned previously, I was a hospital chaplain for a little while. Yes, there I am. About 2 years ago, I began as a hospital chaplain resident at St. Joseph's Medical Center in Tacoma. And it was a very new job for me, never done anything like that. And as I was preparing this sermon, I found myself reflecting on my experience there through these questions that Velotis lays out. And I found it to be a very helpful experience to go through these questions. And so I wanted to share that with you. So the first question, what happened when I began? Well, when I first began that job, our hospital really took a trial-by-fire training approach. And so they gave me the advice. I got there for orientation, which I thought would be an actual orientation, but instead they gave me the advice to always be the calmest person in the room, then handed me a pager and sent me off on my first solo night shift. And I still remember the elevator doors closing as they waved me off, and I was heading to the emergency department, clutching the pager and just telling myself, okay, yeah, I'll just be the calmest person in the room, no problem. Well, what was I feeling? Well, as you might be surprised to find out, I was not feeling like the calmest person in the room. I was completely overwhelmed and doing my best to keep the anxiety and the fear and the confusion I was feeling hidden away, pressed down in me so that no one would see or be affected by it. So third, what was the story I was telling myself? Essentially, I was taking a fake it till you make it approach. Okay, if I can just act super calm, they won't be able to see how not calm I am, and my inner narrative of insecurity and fear will just stay in my little head, and I'll be able to help people completely removed from that anxious part of me. Or so I thought. As it turned out, it was only a few days, I think, of living into this rather presumptuous narrative when I was called to visit the kindest elderly gentleman who was in the midst of transitioning from hospital care into hospice. And as I sat there trying to look like the calmest person in the room, he stopped talking for a moment, and I remember it very clearly. And he just looked at me, and then he leaned across his hospital bed, and he told me, you know, Karis, I'm okay. I'm at peace with myself and with my life, but how are you doing, really? And as I looked at him, a man facing imminent death, and yet who radiated peace of mind even as his body prepared to die. A man who was leaning in to become the chaplain's chaplain, to offer me comfort and encouragement. I realized that my inner life and my mindset mattered more than I had wanted to admit. He had seen me, the real me, and he had broken into my false narrative, not to judge me, but to genuinely care for me and my scared self that day, who was still just trying to figure it all out. And so the fourth question, what does the gospel say? Maybe the gospel says that Jesus meets us in places of weakness, when two or more are gathered. And for me, that question had been embodied. Jesus had just leaned across the hospital bed and seen me in my weakness. And he hadn't turned me away, he had helped me. And it was remarkable. And so we continued in conversation, him asking me questions rather than me asking him questions, and he helped me face and embrace what I was in denial of. And more than that, he modeled for me what I so desperately wanted, which was an inner and outer life that were integrated, and an inner narrative that pointed me towards a more deeply formed life, not only for myself, but for every patient I was going to meet after I left his room. Because the more present I could be with myself, of course, the more present I could be for others, the more I could be like that man and offer help to others. And so Volodis' fifth and final question, what counter-instinctual action is needed? Well, in my case, and in that situation, I needed to stop when everything around me, the pager and the requests, and really just my desire to not mess up, and all of these other requests that were going on in my head, everything was telling me to go, keep going, don't stop, there's no time. And I needed to stop. I needed someone to help me, just to give me permission, even for a moment, to just be honest, and the safety to be vulnerable when I just didn't know how to do it at that time, and perhaps didn't even know if I needed to do it. But that man saw me, and he helped me do it. And so, in this room, we're all going to be in different places. For some of us, our interior lives might feel a bit chaotic, and we're not reacting how we would like to difficult circumstances. We long to live into the qualities of God's grace that we see modeled in Paul in the passage that we read today. And I hope that if this is you today, that you feel and are encouraged that this is possible. These practices of interior examination, yes, they take discipline, they take intentionality, but they can actually bring a tangible change in your life. They can change how you feel and how you are in this world. The world is in desperate need, Volodis writes, of people who are willing to examine themselves before they examine others. But if we're honest, it's a whole lot easier to examine others before we examine ourselves. But no, Volodya says it's ourselves. We need to start with ourselves. Are we willing to do that hard work? And for some of you, you're already doing this work. Perhaps you have a lifetime of practicing interior examination, and so you might identify more with the man that I met in the hospital. And you might also be in the midst of very painful and difficult circumstances, but you have something to give. You're able to lean across that hospital bed, that metaphoric hospital bed, because you've taken the way of self-examination, and now you can help others. God's grace is available. It's always available. It's the kind of grace that meets us in every situation, and it's the kind of grace that transforms our inner thoughts and our emotions, and yet we're at risk of missing its effect if we aren't able to turn to Jesus with intentionality and vulnerability. But when we take the risk to invite Jesus into those deep places through reflection, to not only realize that grace is available, but to realize our specific need of it. Where do we need it in our life? Where are we struggling to accept grace in our life? We will find that Jesus will always meet us, and he will transform us in likely and unlikely places, and through likely and unlikely people. And so the words Paul wrote to the Corinthians that we read today, some 2,000 years ago, are just as true for us now as they were for them then. Now is the time of God's favor, and now is the day of salvation. God's grace is here, and it is effective. And so may we all be open to receiving that effective grace into our lives. Will you pray with me?